My husband's mother deliberately cropped me out of every family photo for 8 years. At their grand anniversary celebration, with everyone watching, she unveiled a massive family portrait where I was literally erased, photoshopped out as if I never existed. I sat there, hands trembling under the table, while my son Elijah looked at me with eyes far too knowing for his 12 years. But just when I thought I would have to swallow my humiliation once again, Elijah stood up, calm and collected, and said, "Before we continue, I think everyone should hear what Grandpa Warren wrote before he died." And in that moment, everything changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hallorans had always been fixtures of Mapleton Heights, their century-old Victorian house looming over Sycamore Avenue like a monument to old money and even older grudges. When I first met Bennett Halloran at Riverdale University, I had no idea what I was walking into. He was charming, brilliant, with a laugh that made everything feel lighter. We were both studying architecture, bonding over our shared love of Frank Lloyd Wright and midnight coffee during finals week. It wasn't until our third date that Bennett mentioned his family's name carried weight back home. "They can be a bit traditional," he'd said, stirring his coffee with an awkward smile. Traditional? What a gentle word for what awaited me. The first time Bennett took me home to meet his family, Vivian Halloran greeted me with a smile that never quite reached. Her eyes, she was elegantly dressed in a cream cashmere sweater, pearl earrings catching the light as she tilted her head to examine me. Her husband, Warren, was more welcoming, a boisterous man with Bennett's same laughing eyes and a firm handshake. That felt genuine. "So, Amara," Vivian had said, pronouncing my name with a slight hesitation, "Bennett tells us you're from Oak Ridge?" The way she said my hometown, a working-class neighborhood just 20 miles away but worlds apart, in socioeconomic status, made it sound like I'd crawled out from under a rock. "Yes," I'd answered, straightening my shoulders. My father taught history at Oak Ridge High for 30 years. Warren had jumped in then, asking about my father's specialty, seeming genuinely interested in my stories about Dad's passion for civil rights history. But Vivian had already moved on, steering Bennett toward a conversation about the Preston's daughter who had just returned from studying in Paris. That first dinner set the tone for what would become years of subtle exclusion. When Bennett proposed, a year later, Vivian's response was a tight smile and, "Well, I suppose this is happening rather quickly." She insisted on an engagement party at the Mapleton Heights Country Club, her territory, where I stood awkwardly in a dress I could barely afford, while she introduced me as Bennett's fiancé without ever using my name. The wedding was a battlefield disguised as a celebration. My simple plans for a garden ceremony were steamrolled by Vivian's vision of a society event. "The Hallorans have certain expectations to maintain," she'd insisted, overriding my choices with practiced efficiency. My parents, modest and uncomfortable, amid the opulence, tried their best to blend in while Vivian's friends whispered behind flutes of champagne. It was during the wedding photos that I first noticed what would become a pattern. Vivian somehow managed to arrange every group shot so that I was positioned on the far edge, easy to crop out later, as I would discover when the framed photos appeared in their home with only half of my body visible. Warren had noticed too. "Don't take it personally," he'd whispered to me at the reception, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Viv has always been protective of Bennett. Only child syndrome, you know. She'll warm up." But she never did. After we had Elijah, things only intensified. Vivian would drop by unannounced to check on her grandson, asking if I was still trying that breastfeeding thing, with thinly veiled disapproval. She'd take photos of Bennett holding the baby, angling the camera to exclude me entirely. For years, I tried everything. I brought thoughtful gifts on holidays. I volunteered to help with the Halloran Family Foundation charity events. I swallowed corrections about how to properly fold napkins or which fork to use first. I smiled through Vivian's helpful suggestions about how to raise Elijah, what clothes to buy him, which preschool was acceptable. Bennett would squeeze my hand under the table, a silent plea for patience, but never directly confronted his mother. "That's just how she is," he'd say later. "She doesn't mean anything by it." But she did. And we both knew it. The exclusion from family photos became so obvious that even friends noticed. At Halloran gatherings, somehow I was always asked to take the picture rather than be in it. When I was included, I'd later discover my face mysteriously shadowed, or my body positioned so far on the edge that I could be easily removed. The family photo wall in the Halloran home told the story clearly. Bennett, Elijah, Vivian, Warren, and various cousins and relatives appeared in dozens of frames. I existed only as an occasional elbow or shoulder at the margin. Warren, in his gruff way, tried to compensate. He made a point of asking about my architectural projects, proudly, telling his friends about the community center I'd designed. He kept a photo of me with Elijah on his desk in his study, the only place in the Halloran house where I existed fully. Everything came to a head at Vivian and Warren's 50th anniversary celebration. They had rented out the grand ballroom at the Mapleton Country Club, with crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow over tables draped in ivory linen. The guest list included everyone who was anyone in their social circle: judges, business owners, old money families whose names appeared on buildings downtown. I had helped Elijah pick out a gift for his grandparents, a handcrafted wooden box where he'd collected memories, ticket stubs from baseball games with Warren, recipes they'd cooked together, small mementos. He was so excited to give it to them, carefully wrapping it in silver paper with a blue bow. The evening progressed with speeches and toasts, with Bennett giving a heartfelt tribute to his parents that brought tears to many eyes. Then came the moment Vivian had been building up all night, the unveiling of a surprise she'd been planning for months. "In honor of 50 years of Halloran family legacy," she announced, gesturing dramatically toward a curtained wall, "I've created something special." The curtains parted to reveal an enormous, professionally crafted family portrait collage, dozens of photos spanning 50 years, artfully arranged around a recent central image of the entire Halloran family. Except I wasn't in it. Not anywhere. In group shots where I had definitely been present, I had been digitally removed, the space where I stood filled in with background. Even in photos of me holding Elijah as a baby, my face and body had been erased, leaving my son looking as if he were floating in space, cradled by invisible arms. A hush fell over the room. I felt the blood drain from my face as several guests glanced uncomfortably in my direction. Bennett stared at the display, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and embarrassment. "Mother, what is this?" he finally asked, his voice strained. "It's our family history," Vivian replied smoothly. "Isn't it beautiful?" I sat there, hands trembling under the table, while my son Elijah looked at me with eyes far too knowing for his 12 years. But just when I thought I would have to swallow my humiliation once again, Elijah stood up, calm and collected. "Before we continue," he said, his young voice steady in the awkward silence, "I think everyone should hear what Grandpa Warren wrote before he died." And in that moment, everything changed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The day before the anniversary celebration, everything seemed deceptively normal. I had spent the morning in my home office, finalizing designs for the Westbrook Community Library project, while Elijah practiced his cello in the sunroom. Bennett was at the firm, working on a high-profile restoration of the old Thornfield Hotel downtown. Our Tudor-style home in the Lakeview district, not quite Mapleton Heights, but respectable enough to appease Vivian. was quiet except for the occasional melody drifting from Elijah's cello and the soft tapping of my pencil against drafting paper. When my phone rang with Vivian's name on the screen, I took a deep breath before answering. These calls were never pleasant, but ignoring them only led to comments about my unavailability later. Amara, her voice came through with its usual crisp efficiency. I need you and Elijah at the house by 4 today. The photographer is coming. For some last-minute anniversary portraits, and Warren insists on having his grandson there. Notice she didn't mention wanting me there, just Elijah. After 8 years of marriage, I was accustomed to these subtle omissions. Of course, I replied. Bennett won't be home until 6, but Elijah and I can be there. Perfect, she said, and I could almost hear her smile. Don't worry about dressing formally. We have everything handled. That should have been my first warning. In Vivian's world, controlling what everyone wore was practically a love language. When Elijah and I arrived at the grand Victorian house on Sycamore Avenue, Vivian answered the door in a powder blue dress I recognized from the family Christmas card 3 years ago. Without greeting me, she pulled Elijah into a hug. There's my handsome grandson. I've laid out the perfect outfit for you upstairs. The navy blazer that looks just like your father's when he was your age. Elijah glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes. I nodded, and he disappeared upstairs. Only then did Vivian seem to notice me standing on her porch. Oh, Amara, thank you for bringing him promptly. She glanced at my cream blouse and charcoal pencil skirt, the same outfit I'd worn when my design for the Riverside Park Pavilion won regional recognition. You can wait in Warren's study if you'd like. These photos won't take long. I had expected this, yet it still stung. Actually, I thought I might be in some of the photos too. For the anniversary celebration? Vivian's smile tightened. Oh, we're just capturing the Halloran lineage today. Warren, myself, Bennett when he arrives later, and Elijah. Family tradition, you understand. Family tradition. The excuse that justified every exclusion. I see, I said, stepping inside. The foyer was immaculate as always, the antique grandfather clock ticking solemnly in the corner. Family photos lined the hallway, generations of Hallorans staring out from gilded frames. I'd walked this hallway hundreds of times, feeling the weight of their judgment. Warren appeared from his study, his tall frame slightly stooped now with advancing age. At 78, his once robust presence had gentled, though his eyes remained sharp under bushy white eyebrows. When he saw me, his face brightened. Amara! Wonderful to see you. He embraced me warmly, smelling of pipe tobacco and the peppermint candies he kept in his pockets. Is Elijah here too? Upstairs changing, Vivian interjected. The photographer will be here any minute. Warren, you should wear the blue tie. Not that brown one. Warren winked at me over his wife's head. Yes, dear. Whatever you say, dear. To me, he whispered, 50 years of marriage and I still don't know how to dress myself, apparently. I laughed, grateful for his warmth. Would you like some help with that tie? I would indeed. He handed me the blue silk tie Vivian had approved. As I looped it around his collar, he spoke quietly. How are things at home? Bennett treating you well? Everything's fine, I replied automatically. Warren fixed me with a knowing look. That's not what I asked. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang, and Vivian swept past us to greet the photographer, a slim man with a leather portfolio and multiple camera bags. Elijah descended the stairs in his navy blazer and khakis, looking so much like a young Bennett that my heart squeezed. You look very handsome, I told him, straightening his collar. Do I have to do this? He whispered. Grandma always makes me stand so stiff. Just a few pictures, I promised. Then maybe we can stop for ice cream on the way home. Vivian clapped her hands for attention. Let's begin in the garden. Warren, bring your walking stick. It adds dignity. Elijah, stand between your grandparents. Amara, Perhaps you could help by holding the reflector? And so it began. For the next hour, I was relegated to assistant, holding equipment, adjusting Elijah's hair, fetching water when Warren looked tired. The photographer, a man named Pascal, gave me apologetic glances as Vivienne directed every shot with military precision. Now one with just the 3 generations of Halloran men, she instructed when Bennett arrived, still in his work suit. Warren, Bennett, and Elijah, the past, present, and future of our family. Bennett caught my eye, mouthing sorry, as he took his place beside his father and son. I smiled back weakly, pretending it didn't hurt to be so deliberately excluded. This was simply how things were in the Halloran world. I was adjacent to the family, never truly part of it. When the formal photography ended, Warren looked exhausted. I helped him to his favorite leather chair in the study, while Vivienne showed Pascal out. Bennett followed us, loosening his tie with a sigh. "I wish you'd been in the photos," he said, laying a hand on my shoulder. "You could have insisted," I replied quietly. Bennett's expression clouded. "You know how Mother gets about these things. It's easier not to argue." Easier for whom, I wanted to ask, but didn't. After 8 years, we'd settled into a pattern. Bennett avoided conflict with his mother. I swallowed my hurt, and Vivienne maintained her perfect family narrative, one where I was an unfortunate footnote rather than a chapter. Warren cleared his throat. "Elijah, my boy, come here a moment." He beckoned our son closer. "Open that bottom drawer of my desk, would you? There's a little wooden box in there." Elijah retrieved an intricately carved mahogany box with brass hinges. Warren took it with hands that trembled slightly, either from age or emotion. "I've been adding to this since before you were born," he told Elijah. "Things I want to be remembered, stories that matter." He opened it to reveal bundles of letters, photographs, and small mementos. When an old man knows his time is growing shorter, he thinks about what he'll leave behind. Not just money or property, but truth. Vivienne appeared, in the doorway, her expression sharpening when she saw the box. "Warren, what are you doing? The doctor said you shouldn't tire yourself." "I'm not an invalid yet, Viv," he said mildly. "Just showing my grandson a few family treasures." "Well, Amara and Elijah should be getting home. It's a school night after all." Her tone left no room for argument. On the drive home, Elijah was unusually quiet, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. Finally, he asked, "Mom, why doesn't Grandma want you in the pictures?" The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its clarity. Children see everything, understand more than we give them credit for. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "people have a certain idea of what their family should look like. And sometimes, they have trouble accepting when things don't match that idea." "But your family," Elijah insisted. "Yes, I am." I reached over to squeeze his hand. No matter what pictures show or don't show. That night, after Elijah went to bed, I found Bennett in his home office, reviewing blueprints. I leaned against the doorframe, gathering courage. "Bennett, I need to talk about tomorrow's anniversary party." He looked up, glasses perched on his nose. "What about it?" "Your mother excluded me from every photo today. Again. And I'm worried about what that's teaching Elijah." Bennett sighed, removing his glasses. "You know how she is with family traditions. The photos were just about the Halloran lineage. And what am I? Just an incubator for the next Halloran? Not actually family?" My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "Of course not," Bennett protested. "But you know Mother has her ways. She's from a different generation. It doesn't mean anything. But it did mean something. It meant everything. How we allow ourselves to be treated sets the example for our children. What was Elijah learning from watching his mother be systematically erased? "I won't make a scene at the anniversary," I promised. "But after that, something has to change. For Elijah's sake, if not for mine." Bennett nodded, though I wasn't sure. He really understood. We'd had variations of this conversation before, and nothing ever changed. Vivian continued her subtle campaign of exclusion. Bennett continued to enable it, and I continued to swallow my hurt for the sake of peace. Little did I know that the next day would change everything, not because of anything I would say or do, but because of a secret Warren had been keeping, and because my 12-year-old son had more courage than all the adults in his life combined. The morning of the anniversary celebration dawned with that particular golden light that seems to bless important days. I woke early, my mind already cycling through the evening ahead. The forced smiles, the careful navigation of Vivian's social minefield, the constant awareness of my status as an outsider. Bennett was still asleep, one arm flung across the empty space where I had been. I watched him for a moment, this man I had loved for over a decade. He was caught between worlds, the progressive architect with vision and compassion, and the dutiful son who could never quite break free from his mother's expectations. Sleep? The worry lines between his eyebrows smoothed out, making him look younger, unburdened. The smell of coffee lured me downstairs, where I was surprised to find Elijah already awake, sitting at the kitchen island with a bowl of cereal and his sketchbook. At 12, he had inherited Bennett's artistic eye and my practicality, a combination that made him both thoughtful and decisive in a way I deeply admired. "You're up early," I said, pouring myself coffee from the pot he'd already brewed. Elijah nodded, not looking up from his drawing, a detailed sketch of what appeared to be his grandfather's study. Couldn't sleep. I peered over his shoulder at the drawing. "That's really good. You've captured Grandpa Warren's desk perfectly." "I like his study," Elijah said, adding shading to the leather chair where Warren often sat. "It's the only room at their house that feels real." The observation struck me with its accuracy. Warren's study, with its worn leather chairs, books that were actually read rather than displayed, and the faint smell of pipe tobacco, stood in stark contrast to the rest of the Halloran house, where everything felt curated for appearance rather than comfort. "Are you nervous about tonight?" I asked, sitting beside him. Elijah shrugged, a gesture so reminiscent of Bennett that it made my heart twist. "Not nervous, just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, then flipped to a new page in his sketchbook, revealing a different drawing. One of a family gathering. In it, I stood slightly apart from the group, a ghost-like figure with a sad smile. The image was so painfully accurate that my breath caught. "About how they treat you," he said simply, "and how Dad lets them. Children see everything." The thought returned to me with uncomfortable clarity. All these years, I'd tried to shield Elijah from the dynamics at play, believing he was too young to notice the subtle cruelties, the deliberate exclusions. But he had been watching, understanding, processing in his quiet way. "It's complicated. Sweetheart," I began, falling back on the adult tendency to minimize difficult truths. "It's not, though," Elijah interrupted, his eyes meeting mine with unexpected maturity. "Grandma doesn't treat you like family. Dad doesn't stop her. You pretend it's okay, but it's not okay." The directness of his assessment left me momentarily speechless. How do you explain to a child the compromises adults make, the battles we choose not to fight, the hurts we learn to live with for the sake of peace? "You're right," I admitted finally. "It's not okay, but sometimes in families we make allowances for people's difficulties." "You mean like how Grandma is difficult?" I couldn't help but smile at his bluntness. "Yes, like that." Elijah turned, back to his drawing, adding more detail to the edges. "Grandpa Warren doesn't think it's okay either." He said it casually, as if commenting on the weather rather than revealing something significant. "Did he tell you that?" I asked, suddenly curious. "Not exactly." Elijah closed his sketchbook, sliding off the stool. "But I heard him talking to Dad about it once. He said that someday everyone would regret treating you like you weren't really family." The revelation settled over me like a gentle weight. Warren, with his gruff kindness and quiet observations, had seen more than he let. Had he really confronted Bennett about it? If so, it hadn't changed anything. At least not that I could see. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of preparation. Bennett worked from home, occasionally emerging from his office to take phone calls in the backyard. I alternated between finalizing design proposals for an upcoming client meeting and helping Elijah prepare for the evening. We laid out his suit, charcoal gray rather than the navy blazer Vivian preferred, and polished his dress shoes until they gleamed. "Do I have to wear a tie?" he asked, wrinkling his nose. "Yes, but you can pick which one." I opened Bennett's tie drawer, letting Elijah browse the options. He selected a deep burgundy one with small silver patterns. Nothing Vivian would have chosen, which I suspected was precisely why he picked it. My small rebel, asserting his independence in the subtle ways available to him. By late afternoon, the quiet tension in our house was palpable. Bennett emerged from his office looking distracted, his hair rumpled from running his hands through. A habit when he was stressed. "Mother called," he announced, dropping onto the sofa beside me. "She wants us there early to greet some of their oldest friends." Of course she did. Any opportunity to orchestrate and control. "How early?" I asked, mentally adjusting our timeline. 6 instead of 7. Bennett loosened his collar, sighing. "She also asked if you could help the catering staff set up the display table." The request, or rather command, was so typical that I almost laughed. Vivian's talent for making me feel like the help rather than family was truly impressive in its consistency. "I'm sure the professional catering staff she hired can manage without me," I replied, keeping my tone light despite the familiar frustration building in my chest. Bennett gave me a pleading look. "It would mean a lot to her if I knew my place." I finished for him. "That's not fair, Amara. Isn't it?" I stood, needing distance. "Your mother has spent 8 years making it clear I'm not really a Halloran. She excluded me from every family photo yesterday, and now she wants me to arrive early to help the staff rather than as a guest celebrating with my husband." Bennett rubbed his temples. "It's her anniversary. Can we just get through tonight without conflict? For my father's sake, if nothing else." The mention of Warren deflated my anger somewhat. The old man had been looking increasingly frail lately, and this celebration meant a great deal to him. Whatever my issues with Vivian, Warren had always treated me with kindness and respect. "Fine," I conceded, "but I'm not helping the catering staff. I'll be there at 6 as a guest with my husband and son." Bennett nodded, relief washing over his features. Conflict averted once again. The Bennett Halloran specialty. As I headed upstairs to dress, I passed Elijah's room. The door was partially open, and I glimpsed him sitting cross-legged on his bed, staring at something in his hands. I paused, watching as he carefully unfolded what appeared to be a letter, the paper yellowed with age. "Elijah?" I called softly. He looked up, startled, quickly refolding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. "Hey, Mom." "What's that?" I asked, curiosity piqued by his secretive behavior. "Nothing important," he said, too casually. "Just something Grandpa Warren gave me to read." Before I could question him further, Bennett called up the stairs that we needed to start getting ready. Elijah slid off his bed, effectively ending the conversation. "I'll be ready on time," he promised, ushering me out of his doorway with unusual assertiveness. As I showered and dressed, selecting a deep emerald gown that always made me feel confident, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was brewing beneath the surface of this evening. Elijah's secretive behavior, his unusually serious demeanor, the mysterious letter from Warren, it all hinted at something beyond the typical Halloran family tension. Whatever storm was coming, I would face it with the same quiet dignity I'd maintained for 8 years as Bennett's wife. But for the first time, I wondered if perhaps I wouldn't be facing it alone. The Mapleton Country Club stood like a temple to old money at the end of a winding, oak-lined drive. Built in 1902 of imposing limestone with Corinthian columns flanking the entrance, it had hosted generations of Halloran celebrations. Tonight, soft golden lights illuminated the facade, and valets in crisp uniforms stood ready to receive guests' vehicles. As Bennett pulled our Audi into the circular drive, I straightened my emerald dress and touched the simple pearl pendant at my neck, my mother's, one of the few pieces of jewelry I owned that Vivian hadn't managed to comment on. Dismissively. "Remember?" Bennett said as the valet opened my door. "Mother's been planning this for months. Let's try to make it special for them." What he meant, of course, was, don't make a scene, don't challenge Vivian, don't expect too much. The same silent request that had governed our marriage. "I know how to behave at social functions, Bennett," I replied, keeping my voice even. "I've had 8 years of practice." Elijah slid out from the back seat, unusually solemn in his suit. The burgundy tie he'd selected stood out among the sea of conservative navy and black worn by most Halloran men. He'd insisted on bringing his messenger bag, too. "For Grandpa's gift," he'd explained, and now it hung across his body, slightly incongruous with his formal attire. The grand ballroom glowed with tasteful opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light over round tables draped in ivory linen. Centerpieces of white roses and silver candelabras anchored each table, while a string quartet played softly from a corner stage. Vivian had outdone herself with classic, understated elegance, the kind that whispered rather than shouted its expense. She spotted us immediately, breaking away from a cluster of silver-haired guests to intercept our entrance. In a floor-length silver gown that complemented her perfectly coiffed hair, Vivian Halloran was the picture of matriarchal authority. "You're late," she said by way of greeting, though a glance at my watch confirmed we were precisely on time. "The Whitcombs and the Prestons have been asking for you, Bennett." Her gaze slid over me with practiced indifference before landing on Elijah. "And there's my handsome grandson. Though I thought we agreed on the navy blazer, darling." "I wanted to wear this," Elijah replied simply, a subtle assertion I couldn't help but admire. Vivian's smile tightened momentarily before she recovered. "Well, come along. Your grandfather has been asking for you." We followed her through the crowd. Bennett immediately pulled into conversation with important associates of his father's. I walked slightly behind, accustomed to this choreography. Bennett absorbed into the inner circle while I navigated the periphery. Warren sat at the head table, looking distinguished in his tuxedo, despite the slight stoop of his shoulders. When he caught sight of us approaching, his face brightened. He stood somewhat shakily and embraced Elijah with genuine warmth. "There he is, my favorite architect in training." Warren held Elijah at arm's length, examining him with obvious pride. "Handsome as your father, but with your mother's good sense, I'd wager." Then he turned to me, taking both my hands in his. "Amara, beautiful as always." He leaned closer, speaking softly. "That green suits you, brings out the fire in your eyes." Warren had always seen me, really seen me, in a way that made his wife's cold dismissal even more striking by contrast. "Thanks. You, Warren," I replied, squeezing his hands gently. "Congratulations on 50 years. Quite an accomplishment." Something flickered across his face. Not quite sadness, but a contemplative gravity. 50 years teaches you what matters and what doesn't," he said enigmatically. "Too often, we learn too late." Before I could ask what he meant, Vivian swooped back in, directing Warren to greet the mayor and his wife who had just arrived. As they moved away, I noticed Elijah watching his grandfather with unusual intensity, one hand unconsciously touching the pocket where he'd hidden that mysterious letter earlier. The next hour passed in a blur of polite small talk and strategic navigation. I chatted with the few guests who acknowledged me directly, mostly Bennett's colleagues from the architectural firm and a handful of younger Halloran relatives who hadn't yet fully absorbed Vivian's subtle cues about my status. Mostly I drifted between conversations, practiced in the art of being present without being noticed. From across the room, I observed Vivian holding court at the center of a group of her closest friends. They were women cut from the same cloth. Wealthy, impeccably groomed arbiters of Mapleton society who wielded their social approval like currency. I'd long ago stopped seeking admission to their circle, having been evaluated and found lacking too many times to count. "She's been talking about the photo display all evening," a voice said beside me. I turned to find Patricia Whitcomb, Warren's younger sister, sipping champagne and watching her sister-in-law with knowing eyes. At 73, Patricia maintained the sharp wit and direct manner that had made her somewhat of an outlier in Halloran circles. Apparently, it's the pièce de résistance of the celebration. "So I've heard," I replied neutrally. Patricia snorted softly. "Vivian never does anything without calculation. 50 years married to Warren, and she's still counting status like poker chips." She gave me a sideways glance. "You've held up well, considering." "Considering what?" "Considering my niece by marriage has spent 8 years trying to erase you." Patricia had never been one to soften harsh truths with social niceties. Not many would have the spine to keep showing up with dignity intact. The frank acknowledgement of what everyone pretended not to notice was oddly validating. "I do it for Bennett and Elijah." Patricia's gaze drifted to where my son stood talking with Warren, their heads bent together in what appeared to be serious conversation. "That boy of yours," she observed. "He has Warren's moral compass, sees right through the nonsense to what matters." She finished her champagne in one elegant swallow. "Vivienne should be careful. The quiet ones are always watching, always understanding more than you think." Before I could respond, the crystal chime of silver against glass cut through the ambient conversation. Bennett's cousin James, acting as informal master of ceremonies, called for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please, take your seats. Dinner will be served shortly. But first, our hostess has prepared a special tribute to the guests of honor." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd as everyone moved toward their assigned tables. The Hallorans and closest relatives were seated at 3 prime tables near the small stage. I found my place card beside Bennett's, with Elijah on my other side. Warren and Vivian occupied the center of the head table, surrounded by their oldest friends. As the room settled, Vivian rose gracefully, commanding attention without raising her voice, a skill I'd always grudgingly admired. "Friends and family," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. "Warren and I are deeply grateful for your presence tonight as we celebrate 50 years of marriage and the legacy we've built together." She spoke eloquently about family traditions, about the Halloran name and its significance in Mapleton history, about the values they'd instilled in their son and now their grandson. It was a masterful performance of maternal pride and wifely devotion. "Tonight," she continued, gesturing toward the curtained wall behind her, "I've prepared a special tribute to our journey together, a visual history of the Halloran family through 5 decades. 2 waitstaff members moved to the heavy velvet curtains, ready to part them at Vivian's signal. Beside me, I felt Elijah tense almost imperceptibly. He sat straighter, his hand dipping into his jacket pocket. "For 50 years," Vivian concluded, her voice rich with carefully modulated emotion, "we have built and protected the Halloran legacy, and tonight, we celebrate not just our past, but the future generations who will carry our name forward." She nodded to the waitstaff, who pulled the curtain cords in perfect unison. The fabric parted to reveal the massive photo display I'd glimpsed being assembled yesterday, now completed with dramatic lighting that highlighted each carefully arranged image. A collective murmur of appreciation rose from the guests as they took in the elaborate collage. Decades of Halloran history displayed in chronological order: Warren and Vivian's wedding, Bennett's childhood, family vacations, graduations, holidays, and at the center, the recent portrait of Warren, Vivian, Bennett, and Elijah. I wasn't in a single photograph. Not one. Even in images I knew had been taken with me present, I had been carefully cropped or edited out. 8 years of marriage, and according to Vivian Halloran's visual history, I simply didn't exist. The erasure was so complete, so deliberate that it took my breath away. I felt Bennett stiffen beside me, finally, registering. The insult for what it was. Around us, guests shifted uncomfortably, the more observant ones noticing the glaring omission. Warren stared at the display, his expression hardening in a way I'd never seen before. Slowly, he turned to look at his wife, something unreadable passing between them. In the awkward silence that followed, I felt Elijah's small hand slip into mine under the table, squeezing tight. The ballroom hummed with the uncomfortable silence. That follows a social transgression too significant to ignore, yet too awkward to address. Vivian stood before her masterpiece, seemingly oblivious to, or perhaps reveling in, the discomfort she'd created. Her smile remained fixed, plastic, and perfect, as she turned to accept congratulations from those either too oblivious or too cowardly to acknowledge what everyone was seeing. I sat perfectly still, years of practice helping me maintain a neutral expression despite the humiliation burning through me. This wasn't just a casual oversight or thoughtless exclusion. This was methodical erasure, executed with surgical precision. Every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone where I had stood beside Bennett, all presented as if I'd never existed. Bennett shifted beside me, his discomfort radiating from him in waves. "Mother?" he finally said, his voice tight as he rose from his chair. "A word." Vivian waved him off with a dismissive flick of her manicured hand. "Not now, darling. The Brightons are just arriving." "Now, Mother." Bennett's tone held an edge I'd rarely heard him use with Vivian. He moved toward her, jaw clenched, as whispers began to ripple through the nearby tables. Warren watched this exchange with an inscrutable expression. He looked older suddenly, the lines in his face deepened by something that might have been sorrow or resignation. His eyes met mine across the table, and I saw an apology there, silent but sincere. Before Bennett could reach Vivian, Elijah stood up beside me. In his charcoal suit with his carefully chosen burgundy tie, he looked both younger and older than his 12 years, a child forced into an adult moment. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice cracking slightly before steadying. The room quieted, attention shifting to this unexpected interruption. Vivian's smile froze, her eyes narrowing at my son's breach of etiquette. "Elijah, darling," she called, sugary sweet. "The children's table has prepared special desserts just for you and the other grandchildren. Why don't you—" "Before we continue," Elijah said, cutting across her with quiet determination. "I think everyone should hear what Grandpa Warren wrote before he died." The words hung in the air, creating a ripple of confusion. Warren, very much alive, looked at his grandson with a mixture of surprise and something else, almost like relief. "What are you talking about, young man?" Vivian said sharply. "Your grandfather is right here. This is hardly the time for games." But Elijah didn't back down. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the folded paper I'd glimpsed earlier in his room. The yellowed page looked fragile in his small hands, the creases worn as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. "Grandpa gave me this last month," Elijah explained, looking directly at his grandmother without flinching. "He said it was important, that I should read it when the time was right." Warren cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. "Let the boy speak, Vivian." His voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to surprise even his wife. Vivian's composure slipped for a moment, her eyes darting between her husband and grandson. "This is ridiculous. We're in the middle of a celebration." "Let him speak," Warren repeated, more firmly this time. Elijah unfolded the letter with careful movements. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, the only sign of his nervousness. He took a deep breath and began to read. To my family, to be read when I am gone, or when the truth can no longer wait. Elijah's clear voice carried across the now silent ballroom. After 50 years of marriage, I find myself looking back on a life filled with accomplishments, privileges, and blessings, but also with regrets. Chief among them is my silence. Vivian stood frozen, color draining from her face. Bennett moved closer to our son, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing concern. I have watched for 8 years. Elijah continued reading. As my daughter-in-law Amara has been systematically excluded, diminished, and erased from our family narrative, I have watched my son Bennett fail to defend the woman he claims to love. I have watched my wife orchestrate this campaign with the precision and determination that once made me fall in love with her, now twisted toward a purpose I cannot condone. A collective intake of breath rippled through the gathering. Patricia Whitcomb, seated nearby, nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes gleaming with what might have been approval. I have remained silent to keep peace, to avoid conflict in my final years. But in doing so, I have become complicit in a cruelty I never intended. Elijah's voice grew stronger as he read, as if drawing courage from his grandfather's words. Amara Carlton Halloran is as much a part of this family as anyone born to the name. Her intelligence, grace, and quiet strength have brought more honor to the Halloran legacy than any ancestral connection. My throat tightened at Warren's words. All these years I had thought he merely tolerated me, offering small kindnesses to counterbalance Vivian's coldness. I had never imagined he held me in such esteem. Bennett moved to stand beside our son, his hand coming to rest protectively on Elijah's shoulder. His eyes sought mine across the table, filled with a dawning realization about what had been happening all these years. By the time this letter is read, Elijah continued, I will likely be gone. My final wish is that this pattern of exclusion ends with me, that my son finds the courage to stand beside his wife, that my grandson grows up in a home where love is not conditional upon meeting Vivian Halloran's approval. Warren sat straighter in his chair, his eyes never leaving his wife's face as his own words were read aloud. Vivian had gone completely still, her carefully constructed facade cracking around the edges. And to my wife of 50 years, Elijah read, his voice softening, I have loved you through decades of joy and hardship, but I do not love this version of you, small and fearful, guarding the Halloran name like a miser guards gold. Our family's legacy is not in our name or social position, but in the character of those who carry it forward. The room had fallen so silent that the soft rustle of the letter in Elijah's hand seemed deafening. Guests sat uncomfortably, witnessing what should have been a private family reckoning. If my death is what it takes for this truth to finally be spoken, then at least my passing will have served a purpose. But if by some chance this letter is, read while I still draw breath, know that every word comes from a heart that has carried this burden for too long. Elijah paused, his young voice wavering slightly before he finished. With love and hope for healing, Warren James Halloran. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. I sat motionless, tears threatening behind my eyes but not falling. This moment wasn't about my pain or vindication. It was about truth finally breaking through years of carefully maintained pretense. Warren rose slowly from his seat, the effort visible in the stiffness of his movements. He walked to where Elijah stood and placed a gnarled hand on his shoulder. I wrote that letter 3 months ago, he said, his voice carrying despite its softness. After my heart attack, when doctors weren't sure I would recover, I gave it to Elijah because I knew he, of all people, would understand its importance. He turned to face the room, his typical joviality replaced by a solemn dignity. I hadn't planned for it to be read tonight, but seeing that, he gestured toward the photo display with unmistakable disgust. I can't say I'm sorry it was. Vivian finally found her voice. Warren, you're making a scene, she hissed, reaching for his arm. We can discuss family matters privately. Warren gently but firmly removed her hand. No, Vivian. That's exactly how we've ended up here, by keeping the uncomfortable truths private while the cruelty happens in plain sight. He turned to look at me directly, his eyes clear and resolute. Amara, I apologize for every moment I remained silent, for every time I offered small kindnesses instead of the respect and defense you deserved. The sincerity in his voice nearly undid me. All these years of feeling invisible, of doubting my place, of wondering if I was overreacting to Vivian's subtle campaign, validated in an instant by the one person whose opinion might actually matter to the Halloran matriarch. Bennett moved to my side, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Dad, I never realized— You didn't want to realize, Warren corrected gently. It was easier not to see. The truth of those words hung in the air between father and son. Years of Bennett choosing the path of least resistance, of prioritizing. His mother's approval over his wife's dignity, laid bare in 7 simple words. Elijah carefully refolded the letter and handed it to his grandfather. Warren took it, then surprised everyone by walking to me and placing it in my hands instead. This belongs to you now, he said quietly. Proof that at least one Halloran saw you clearly. The weight of Warren's letter felt substantial in my hands, as if the truth it contained had physical mass. Around us, the ballroom remained suspended in that peculiar silence that follows when social conventions have been utterly shattered. Waitstaff hovered uncertainly at the edges of the room, champagne flutes balanced on silver trays, unsure whether to proceed with the toast that should have followed Vivian's presentation. Vivian herself stood rigidly beside the photo display, her composure visibly fracturing. For perhaps the first time in the 8 years I'd known her, she appeared genuinely at a loss. The carefully constructed narrative she'd been crafting for decades, now exposed for the calculated fiction it was. "How dare you?" she finally said, her voice low and taut with suppressed fury. She wasn't looking at me, but at Warren, as if I remained unworthy of direct address even now. 50 years of marriage and you choose to humiliate me like this? In front of everyone? Warren didn't flinch from her anger. I chose nothing, Viv. Our grandson made this choice because he saw what the adults around him refused to acknowledge. He's a child, Vivian hissed. He doesn't understand. I understand everything, Grandma. Elijah's voice was clear and steady. He stood straight-backed beside me, his young face solemn but resolute. I understand that you tried to make my mom disappear. I understand that Dad let you do it. And I understand that Grandpa was the only one brave enough to say it was wrong. The simple, devastating accuracy of a child's perception hung in the air. Bennett moved as if physically struck by his son's words, color rising in his face. Eli, it's not that simple, he began, reaching toward our son. Elijah stepped back. It is that simple, Dad. Mom's been part of this family for 8 years, but she's not in a single photo up there. He pointed at the display. You never stopped it. Not once. The clarity of his indictment left Bennett speechless. I watched my husband, this man I had loved through years of subtle humiliations, struggle to find words to defend the indefensible. Patricia Whitcomb rose from her seat, champagne glass in hand. Well, she declared with the confidence that comes from being too wealthy and too old to care about social niceties, I think a toast is in order. She raised her glass toward me. To Amara, who has shown more grace in the face of pettiness than most of us could manage. And to young Elijah, who reminds us that moral courage doesn't wait for gray hair. A murmur rippled through the room. Then, slowly, Warren's oldest friend, Judge Martin Blackwood, stood, raising his glass as well. To truth, however uncomfortable, and to Warren, who finally found his voice. One by one, others began to stand. Not everyone, but enough. Bennett's colleagues from the architectural firm, Warren's sister and her children, even the mayor's wife, whose social allegiance to Vivienne had seemed unshakable, lifted her glass with a small nod in my direction. Vivienne's face contorted with barely contained rage. "This is absurd. You're all making a spectacle of a private family matter?" "Private?" Warren repeated, his eyebrows rising. "There's nothing private about that display, Vivienne. You made a very public statement when you erased our daughter-in-law from 8 years of family history. She is not—" Vivienne began, then stopped herself, aware of how the room had turned. "Not what?" I asked, finally finding my voice. "Not a Halloran? Not good enough? Not from the right background?" I stood, the letter still in my hand. "I've spent 8 years trying to earn a place in this family, Vivienne. 8 years of swallowing, small cruelties and pretending not to notice when you deliberately excluded me. For Bennett's sake, for Elijah's. But I'm done earning what should have been freely given." Bennett stepped toward me, his expression stricken. "Amara, I never meant—" "You never meant to hurt me," I finished for him. "You just never meant to stand up for me either." The raw truth of it hung between us. Bennett had always taken the path of least resistance, preserving peace at the expense of justice. And I had allowed it, believing that patience and dignity would eventually win Vivienne's approval. We had both been wrong. Warren moved to stand beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "The Halloran name has been treated like a crown in this family for too long," he said, addressing the room but looking directly at his wife. "As if it confers some special worthiness, some elevated status. But a name is just a collection of letters until the person carrying it gives it meaning." He turned to Elijah, his weathered face softening with pride. "Our grandson understands that. He's more Halloran in his character than many who were born to it." The subtle emphasis on many wasn't lost on anyone. Vivienne's lips pressed into a bloodless line. "I think," Warren continued, "that 50 years is long enough to live with comfortable lies. If this anniversary is to mean anything, let it mark the end of pretense and the beginning of honesty." An uncomfortable silence followed, broken only when one of the waiters, a young man with an unfortunate sense of timing, nervously approached to announce that dinner was ready to be served. The announcement broke the tension, providing a welcome diversion from the emotional standoff. Guests began moving back to their tables, conversation resuming in hushed, urgent tones. The social machinery, momentarily stalled, creaked back into motion, though nothing was quite the same. Bennett stood frozen between his parents and me, the conflict that had always simmered beneath the surface now impossible to ignore. I saw the moment when some internal decision crystallized in his eyes. "Mother," he said, turning to Vivienne with newfound resolve, "take down that display." Vivienne's eyes widened. "I most certainly will not. Do you have any idea how much work—" "Take it down," Bennett repeated, "or I will do it myself, right now." The two stared at each other, decades of unspoken dynamics shifting in real time. Vivienne searching her son's face for the acquiescent boy she'd raised, Bennett refusing to be that boy any longer. "Bennett, be reasonable," she tried again, her tone softening to the cajoling one that had always worked before. "We can discuss this tomorrow, as a family. Let's not ruin your father's celebration." "The celebration was ruined the moment you unveiled that display," Bennett replied. He turned to the nearest waiter. "Please take down those photos immediately." The young man glanced uncertainly between Bennett and Vivienne, caught in the crossfire of family politics. "Now," Bennett insisted, with an authority I'd rarely heard him use. As the waitstaff hesitantly moved to comply, Vivienne grabbed Bennett's arm. "You choose her over your own mother? After everything I've done for you?" Bennett gently but firmly removed her hand. I'm choosing my wife, Mother. I should have done it years ago. Elijah moved to stand beside his father, his young face serious, but somehow lighter, as if unburdened. Dad's doing the right thing, Grandma, he said quietly. That's what you always told me was most important. Doing the right thing even when it's hard. The irony of having her own platitudes turned against her wasn't lost on Vivian. She looked between her son and grandson, seeing perhaps for the first time that she had lost something more precious than social standing, the unquestioning loyalty she had taken for granted. As the photos were carefully removed from display, Vivian turned to Warren, seeking the alliance that had sustained their 50-year marriage. Are you going to let this happen? Let them dismantle our celebration? Warren considered his wife with tired eyes. This was never our celebration, Viv. This was your performance, your careful curation of the Halloran image. He shook his head slowly. I've enabled it for decades, but I can't do it anymore. The finality in his tone seemed to reach Vivienne in a way nothing else had. For just a moment, her carefully maintained facade cracked completely, revealing something raw and almost vulnerable beneath. Fear, perhaps, or the disorientation of someone whose reality is suddenly, irrevocably altered. Then, with the social instincts honed over a lifetime, she composed herself. I see, she said, her voice brittle as thin ice. She turned to the room at large, summoning a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It seems there has been a change of plans. Please, everyone, proceed to dinner. The Halloran family. She paused, the word family catching slightly in her throat. Needs a moment. As guests awkwardly moved toward their tables, Vivian walked with rigid dignity toward the exit, her silver gown catching the light as she disappeared through the ballroom doors. Bennett watched her go, conflict evident in his expression. Part of him still wanted to follow, to smooth things over as he always had. I could see the pull of lifelong patterns warring with his newfound resolve. Let her go, Warren said quietly. Some reckonings need to happen in private. Bennett nodded, slowly, then turned to me. In his eyes I saw regret, determination, and something like hope. Amara, he said, taking my hands in his. I've failed you for 8 years. I'm so sorry. The simple acknowledgement, spoken plainly without excuses or qualifications, broke something loose inside me. A knot of hurt I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten the weight of it until it began to lift. Yes, I agreed, not offering absolution. Too quickly. You have. Bennett nodded, accepting this truth without defense. I want to make it right, starting now. The remainder of the evening unfolded with a strange dual quality. The outer veneer of celebration continuing while something fundamental had irrevocably shifted beneath the surface. The string quartet played on. Waiters circulated with champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres. Guests made polite conversation, though the events they had witnessed provided the undercurrent to every interaction. Bennett, Elijah, Warren, and I took our seats at the head table, the empty chair where Vivian should have been standing as stark testimony to what had transpired. Warren appeared simultaneously exhausted and unburdened, as if the weight of long-held secrets had been physically pressing on him. I should check on her, Bennett said after several minutes, glancing toward the doors where his mother had disappeared. Warren shook his head. Give her time. Vivian has built her identity around controlling the Halloran narrative for 50 years. Having that control stripped away won't be easy for her to accept. Bennett looked uncertain. Still, to leave her alone when... She's not alone, Warren interjected. Patricia followed her. My sister has always been the only person who could speak truth to Vivian and be heard. I wasn't sure even Patricia Whitcomb's straight-talking wisdom could penetrate Vivian's armor of righteous indignation, but I kept this doubt to myself. The evening had already seen enough confrontation. As dinner was served, Warren turned to Elijah, his weathered face softening with unmistakable pride. You showed remarkable courage tonight, young man. Elijah shrugged, suddenly appearing his age again after the startling maturity he'd displayed. I just did what was right. The simplest explanation, and the truest, Warren agreed. But don't underestimate how rare that is. Most adults spend their lives avoiding what's right when it's difficult. I watched my son absorb this, his expression thoughtful. For all the discomfort of the evening, I couldn't help feeling a deep pride in the person he was becoming, someone who recognized injustice and refused to be complicit in it, even when that meant standing against family traditions and expectations. Bennett reached over to squeeze my hand beneath the table. I meant what I said, he told me quietly. I want to make things right. It's not that simple, I replied, matching his hushed tone as guests around us ate and conversed. 8 years of patterns don't change in one night, Bennett? I know. His expression was solemn, genuine in a way I hadn't seen in too long. But they can start to change, if you're willing to give me the chance. There was no easy answer to that. Part of me wanted to embrace this newfound resolve, to believe that tonight marked a genuine turning point in our marriage and in Bennett's relationship with his mother. Another part, the part that had endured years of small betrayals and compromises, remained wary, reluctant to trust too quickly. Let's just get through tonight, I said finally. We can talk about where we go from here tomorrow. Bennett nodded, accepting this non-answer with more grace than he might have shown before. Perhaps Elijah's example was already reshaping him, in subtle ways. As the main course was cleared and dessert prepared, James called for everyone's attention once again. The traditional anniversary toasts were scheduled next, moments that would normally feature Vivian prominently. Her absence created an awkward vacuum in the carefully planned program. Warren stood without being called, taking the responsibility upon himself. He looked tired but composed, a man who had made peace with a difficult decision. Friends and family, he began, his voice carrying across the ballroom. This evening has taken an unexpected turn, as life often does. I want to thank you all for your patience and understanding. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before continuing. 50 years of marriage is indeed worth celebrating. Vivian and I have built a life together that has brought us success, status, and a wonderful son and grandson. For that, I am profoundly grateful. Warren lifted his water glass, having declined champagne earlier. But tonight has also reminded me that longevity alone is not the true measure of success in a marriage. Truth, respect, and kindness matter more than years accumulated or appearances maintained. The room had fallen silent, guests captivated by this unexpected deviation from the standard anniversary platitudes. My grandson, Warren continued, nodding toward Elijah, showed me tonight what courage looks like, the courage to speak truth, even when it disrupts comfortable patterns. The courage to stand up for someone you love, even when doing so carries a cost. His gaze shifted to me, warmth in his tired eyes. And my daughter-in-law has shown me what quiet dignity looks like, in the face of persistent unkindness. Amara, I want to say publicly what I should have said years ago. You are a Halloran in every way that matters. Not because you married my son, but because you embody the values this family should aspire to. Unexpected tears pricked my eyes at this public acknowledgement. After years of feeling invisible, of questioning my own perceptions, Warren's words offered a validation I hadn't realized how deeply I needed. To my son. Warren turned to Bennett, his expression softening further. You are a good man who has been caught between loyalty to your mother and loyalty to your wife. That's an impossible position, and I bear some responsibility for allowing it to continue. But tonight, you chose correctly. I'm proud of you. Bennett swallowed hard, nodding once in acknowledgement. And finally, Warren concluded, to my wife of 50 years. Vivian is not here at this moment, and that is her choice. But I want to say that despite our differences, despite the hard truths exposed tonight, 5 decades together counts for something. Vivian and I have shared a life with all its complexities. That doesn't excuse the hurts inflicted, but it does mean that healing, if possible, is worth pursuing. He raised his glass higher. So I ask you all to join me in a toast, not to a perfect marriage or a flawless family, but to truth, to growth, and to the courage to begin again, even after 50 years. Glasses rose throughout the ballroom, accompanied by a murmured chorus of, "To truth and courage." The sincerity in the room was palpable, a rare moment of genuine emotion breaking through the usual social veneer of such gatherings. As Warren returned to his seat, looking drained from the effort, the double doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Vivian stood there, Patricia slightly behind her. The Halloran matriarch had composed herself, her makeup freshly applied, her posture impeccable. But something in her expression had changed, a hairline fracture in the perfect facade she'd maintained for decades. She walked slowly to the head table, all eyes following her progress. When she reached us, she looked first at Warren, something unspoken passing between them. Then, to everyone's surprise, she turned to me. "Amara," she said, my name sounding strange on her lips after years of being addressed indirectly. "I believe I owe you a conversation. Not an apology, not yet, but an acknowledgement, which from Vivian Halloran was no small concession." "Yes," I agreed steadily. "I believe you do." She nodded once, then turned to her grandson. "Elijah," she said, her voice softening slightly. "You have your grandfather's moral clarity. It's an admirable quality." Elijah regarded her warily but nodded in acceptance of this olive branch. Vivian took her seat beside Warren, her spine rigid, her expression carefully controlled. The evening's program resumed, dessert was served, and the surreal quality of the celebration continued. But beneath the social niceties, tectonic plates had shifted. The Halloran family would never be quite the same. Later, as the event began winding down, I found myself standing alone near the terrace doors, taking a moment of solitude amid the emotional turbulence of the evening. Patricia Whitcomb appeared, beside me, a fresh glass of champagne in her elegant hand. "Well," she said, her shrewd eyes assessing me, "you've survived the Halloran gauntlet with more grace than most would have managed." I smiled faintly. "I'm not sure survived is the right word yet. The night isn't over." Patricia laughed, a rich sound unburdened by social restraint. "Oh, the confrontation part is over, my dear. Now comes the reconstruction, which, between us, is often the harder work." She wasn't wrong. Standing up to injustice took courage, but rebuilding relationships on a foundation of truth rather than pretense, that was the real challenge that lay ahead. "Vivian won't change overnight," Patricia continued, sipping her champagne. 50 years of being the unquestioned authority in this family has calcified certain habits. But Warren's letter shook her, and your son's courage shamed her, though she'd never admit it. "I don't need her to change completely," I said, surprising myself with the realization as I spoke it. "I just need her to acknowledge my place in this family, to stop the deliberate erasure." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Reasonable boundaries, always the sign of a strong person." She patted my arm with surprising affection. "You'll be all right, Amara Halloran, and so will that remarkable son of yours." As she drifted away to corner some unsuspecting guest with her unfiltered observations, I watched Bennett approach. He had spent the last hour moving between social obligations and checking on his mother, but his eyes had found me regularly across the room, as if reassuring himself that I was still there. "Ready to go home?" he asked, coming to stand beside me. "Beyond ready," I admitted. "Elijah's saying goodbye to his grandfather," Bennett said. "They've become quite close these past few months, haven't they?" I thought of the letter, of the secret Warren and Elijah had kept between them. They understand each other. Both of them see things clearly, without the filters the rest of us use to make uncomfortable truths more palatable. Bennett was quiet for a moment. "I've been hiding behind those filters for too long," he finally said, telling myself I was keeping the peace when really I was just avoiding conflict, taking the easy path instead of the right one. "Yes," I agreed, not softening the truth. "You were. I want to be better," he said simply. "For you. For Elijah. For myself." I studied my husband's face, seeing both the man I had fallen in love with and the man who had disappointed me countless times. Both were real. Both were standing before me, asking for another chance. "That starts tomorrow," I said. "Tonight, let's just go home." The drive home from Mapleton Country Club unfolded in a contemplative silence. Elijah had fallen asleep in the back seat, emotionally drained from the evening's events. Bennett drove with careful attention, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while I watched the familiar landmarks of Mapleton Heights slip past. The stone church on Willow Street, the historic town square with its ornate gazebo, the row of boutiques and cafes now darkened for the night. "You know what's strange?" I said softly, breaking the silence as we turned onto Cedar Lane. "I've spent 8 years feeling like I needed to earn my place in your family. Tonight, I realized I never wanted what Vivian was offering anyway." Bennett glanced at me, surprise evident in his expression. "What do you mean?" "The Halloran name as Vivian defines it. Status, appearance, social position. That was never what mattered to me." I looked out at the passing homes, each one a statement of wealth and position in Mapleton's rigid hierarchy. "I just wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged as your wife, Elijah's mother, part of the family. Not for the name, but for the connection." Bennett was quiet for a long moment. "I never saw it that way," he finally admitted. "I always thought you were hurt because Mother didn't accept you into Mapleton society." The revelation that Bennett had so fundamentally misunderstood my feelings for 8 years was both painful and enlightening. We had been having different conversations this time, me asking for basic respect and inclusion, him thinking I wanted access to his mother's social world. "I never cared about joining the Mapleton Historical Society or being invited to her charity galas," I said, a hint of frustration creeping into my voice. "I cared about having my existence acknowledged, about not being edited out of our son's childhood memories." Our Tudor-style home appeared ahead, warm light glowing from the porch we'd designed together in our first year of marriage. Bennett pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine but made no move to exit the car. "I've been so blind," he said quietly, staring straight ahead. "Not just about Mother's behavior, but about what you were really asking for all these years." In the back seat, Elijah stirred but didn't wake, his face peaceful in sleep, the burgundy tie he'd selected with such deliberate care now loosened around his neck. "Let's get him to bed," I said, unwilling to continue this conversation. "With our son potentially listening. We can talk after." The familiar routine of carrying our sleeping child inside centered me, grounding the evening's emotional chaos in the concrete reality of parenthood. Bennett carefully lifted Elijah from the car while I went ahead to turn on lights and pull back the covers on his bed. Together, we removed his shoes and suit jacket, leaving him in his shirt and pants rather than risking waking him to change into pajamas. As I tucked the comforter around him, Elijah's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Did I do okay, Mom?" he mumbled, already drifting back toward sleep. I smoothed his hair from his forehead, my throat tight with emotion. "You did more than okay, sweetheart. You were the bravest person in the room tonight." He smiled faintly, eyes closing again. Grandpa helped me practice what to say. The revelation that Warren had not only given Elijah the letter, but had actually prepared him for tonight was surprising but somehow fitting. The old man had seen in his grandson a moral clarity that the adults in the family had lost. "Sleep well," I whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead before Bennett and I quietly left the room. Downstairs, I moved through the familiar motions of post-event decompression, shoes off, jewelry on the entryway table, a glass of water from the kitchen. Bennett watched me from the doorway, his tie undone and hanging loose around his neck, still wearing the formal jacket that matched the one his father had worn tonight. "I need to ask you something," he said as I leaned against the kitchen counter. "And I need you to be completely honest, even if the answer hurts." I nodded, bracing myself. Has our marriage been a lie? The question emerged raw, vulnerable in a way Bennett rarely allowed himself to be. All these years, while I thought we were happy despite Mother's difficulties, have you been secretly miserable? The question deserved careful consideration. Had I been miserable? There had certainly been moments of acute hurt, of bitter disappointment when Bennett failed to defend me. But there had also been joy, partnership, and the shared wonder of raising Elijah. Not a lie, I said finally. More, like a house with a crack in its foundation. Most days you don't notice it. Life goes on and you focus on the good parts, the garden you're growing, the memories you're making. But the crack is always there, and over time it widens unless it's repaired. Bennett crossed the kitchen to stand before me, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, the same ones Elijah had inherited. "Can it be repaired?" he asked quietly. "Or has it gone too far?" I thought about Warren's letter, about Elijah's courage, about Vivian's small but significant step toward acknowledgement tonight. About 8 years of small wounds balanced against the family we had built together. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. "But I'm willing to find out if you're willing to do the work." Relief washed over his features. "I am. Whatever it takes." We moved to the living room, the formal clothes from the evening increasingly incongruous in our familiar space with its comfortable furniture and family photos. Photos where I was present, visible, included without question. "You know this isn't just about us," I said, as we sat on the sofa where we'd spent countless evenings reading, talking, simply being together. "It's about Elijah, too. Tonight he took a stand that no child should have to take. He shouldn't be the one protecting me from his grandmother's behavior." Bennett nodded soberly. "You're right. And it's not fair that he saw what I refused to see." "Children often do," I observed. "They haven't learned all the social filters and justifications we use to ignore uncomfortable truths." We sat in silence for a moment, the events of the evening, settling around us like dust after an earthquake. Everything looked the same, but the landscape had fundamentally shifted. "I think," Bennett said carefully, "that we need to establish clear boundaries with my mother going forward, not cutting her off. That would hurt my father and Elijah, but clear, non-negotiable expectations about how she treats you." The fact that he was suggesting this without prompting felt like a small miracle, the first concrete evidence that something had truly changed tonight. "And if she can't meet those expectations?" I asked, needing to know he'd thought this through. "Then, we limit our contact to what's healthy for our family," he replied without hesitation. "You and Elijah are my priority now. I should have made that clear years ago." The words I'd longed to hear for so long brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Not from joy, it was too soon for that, but from relief that I was finally being heard. "It won't be easy," I warned. "Your mother has had things her way for 50 years. She won't change overnight, if at all." "I know." Bennett reached for my hand, his touch tentative, asking permission rather than assuming. "But that's her journey, not ours. We can only control how we respond." I allowed my fingers to entwine with his, this small physical connection a first step toward rebuilding what had been damaged. "Tomorrow's Sunday," Bennett said after a comfortable silence. "Mother will expect us at brunch, as always." The weekly Halloran family brunch at Warren and Vivian's house had been a fixture of our marriage, an obligation I'd come to dread for its predictable pattern of subtle exclusions and unacknowledged slights. "Do you want to go?" Bennett asked, surprising me again with his willingness to break tradition. I considered the question carefully. The easy answer would be no. To use this moment of leverage to break free from an uncomfortable ritual. But isolating ourselves completely would only create new problems. Yes, I decided. But differently this time. We arrive together, we leave together if she crosses any lines, and you don't leave me alone with her for those kitchen conversations that are really just opportunities for her to make comments. About my cooking or my clothes. Bennett nodded, accepting these terms without argument. And I think we should bring something from us, not just you, but explicitly from both of us. The suggestion was meaningful in its simplicity. For years, Vivian had acted as if any gifts or contributions I brought were solely from me, never acknowledging the joint nature of our offerings as she did with every other couple. "I'd like that," I said, feeling the first tentative tendril of hope unfurling within me. Bennett shifted closer on the sofa, his expression earnest. "I know tonight doesn't fix 8 years of failing you, but I want you to know that I see it now. All of it. And I'm so sorry for every time I chose the path of least resistance instead of standing beside you." There was nothing performative. In his apology, no defensive qualifications or excuses. Just a straightforward acknowledgement of hurt caused and responsibility accepted. "Thank you," I said simply, accepting his words for what they were. A beginning, not an end. We sat together in the quiet of our home, the evening's formal clothes gradually feeling less and less like costumes as we settled back into ourselves. Not just Bennett and Amara Halloran as defined by Vivian's narrow parameters, but the true versions of ourselves that had first fallen in love over coffee and architectural sketches years ago. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The conversation with Vivian that I'd been promised. Warren's health concerns that had been momentarily overshadowed by tonight's events. The delicate process of redefining family dynamics that had calcified over decades. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of upheaval, there was a fragile peace, a sense that something broken had begun the slow process of mending. "We should check on Elijah," I said eventually, glancing toward the stairs. "Make sure he's really okay after everything that happened." Bennett nodded, rising from the sofa and offering his hand to help me up, a small gesture of partnership that felt symbolically significant after the evening we'd experienced. Together, we climbed the stairs to our son's room, united in purpose, for the first time in longer than I could remember. 3 months after the anniversary celebration that had so dramatically altered the Halloran family landscape, I stood in our kitchen preparing for Sunday brunch. Sunlight streamed through the bay windows, illuminating the marble countertops where I arranged fresh blueberry scones on a ceramic platter. My mother's recipe, one of the few family traditions I'd managed to maintain despite Vivian's orchestrated erasure of my history. "Need any help?" Bennett appeared in the doorway, dressed casually in jeans and a blue button-down, Elijah trailing behind him with a book tucked under his arm. "Can you grab the fruit salad from the refrigerator?" I asked, adjusting the cloth napkin lining the basket. "And make sure the gift bag is in the car." The weekly Halloran family brunch had continued in the months following the anniversary, but with subtle, significant shifts in dynamics. We now alternated locations between Warren and Vivian's Victorian on Sycamore Avenue and our home, a change Bennett had suggested that gave us equal footing in the family ritual. Today was our turn to host, making it the 4th time Warren and Vivian had come to us rather than summoning us to them. Elijah set his book on the counter and began helping without being asked, gathering silverware from the drawer and arranging it on the dining table with careful precision. At 12, nearly 13 now, he'd grown an inch since that pivotal night, his face gradually losing its childish roundness. But more striking than his physical growth was the quiet confidence he'd developed, a certainty about his place, in the world that I hadn't possessed until well into adulthood. "Do you think Grandpa will like the new sketches?" he asked, referring to the architectural drawings he'd been working on under Warren's guidance. The two had forged an even deeper bond in recent months, with Warren teaching Elijah the fundamentals of design that had once been his passion before business obligations claimed his focus. "He'll love them," I assured him. "He's incredibly proud of your eye for detail." Bennett smiled, watching our son with unmistakable pride. "He told me last week that Elijah has more natural talent than either of us." The doorbell rang precisely. At 11, Warren's military punctuality still intact after all these years. Bennett moved to answer it while Elijah and I made final adjustments to the table setting. "Welcome," I heard Bennett greet his parents, his voice warm but no longer carrying that edge of anxious deference that had characterized his interactions with Vivian for so long. Warren entered first, moving more slowly these days, but with his eyes still bright beneath bushy white eyebrows. His heart condition had stabilized with new medication, but the health scare that had prompted his letter writing remained a shadow over the family's future. Behind him came Vivian, elegant as always in a pale blue dress and pearls, carrying a small potted orchid wrapped in silver paper. "Amara?" Warren embraced me warmly, the smell of his aftershave familiar and comforting. "Something smells wonderful." "Blueberry scones," I replied, returning his hug. "My mother's recipe." "The ones from that little bakery in Oak Ridge?" he asked, referring to my hometown with none of the dismissive tone Vivian had always used. "Delicious." Vivian approached next, the orchid extended before her like a shield or an offering, depending on how one chose to interpret the gesture. "For your table," she said, handing it to me with a small nod that wasn't quite warmth, but wasn't coldness either. "The blue variety is quite rare. The woman at the nursery said it thrives in eastern light." "Perhaps in your studio window?" The fact that she knew which direction my home architecture studio faced, had paid enough attention to remember such a detail, was one of the small, unexpected shifts that had emerged in our cautious post-anniversary relationship. "It's beautiful," I acknowledged, accepting both the plant and the olive branch it represented. "Thank you, Vivian. We weren't friends. We would probably never be close in the way mothers and daughters-in-law could be in more fortunate circumstances. But we had achieved a fragile détente built on mutual respect. Or at least, Vivian's reluctant acknowledgement that I was, irrevocably, part of the Halloran family, whether she approved or not. "Grandpa." Elijah emerged from the dining room, his face lighting up. "I finished the elevation drawings. Want to see?" Warren smiled broadly. "Lead the way, architect." As they disappeared toward Elijah's room where his drafting materials were spread across his desk, Bennett guided his mother toward the living room. "The Henderson project is nearly complete," he told her, referencing the historic downtown renovation his firm had been working on. "The original crown molding was salvageable, just as you thought it might be." Vivian nodded, settling onto the sofa with practiced elegance. "The craftsmanship in those pre-war buildings is remarkable. Your father always said it was a shame to replace what could be restored." I brought coffee to the living room, the delicate china cups another change in our routine. Before, Vivian had always insisted on serving, maintaining control over even this small ritual. Now, in my home, she accepted the cup I offered with a murmured, "Thank you," that would have been unthinkable 4 months ago. The conversation flowed more easily than I would have believed possible after that explosive night. Bennett discussed his current projects. I shared updates on the community center I was designing for Oak Ridge, and Vivian offered occasional observations about local architecture that revealed a surprisingly knowledgeable eye. The subjects remained safe, no personal revelations or heated discussions, but the absence of tension was itself remarkable. When Warren and Elijah rejoined us, they brought an energy that further lightened the atmosphere. Warren's pride in his grandson's work was obvious, and even Vivian seemed genuinely impressed by the detailed sketches Elijah shared. "You have real talent," she told him, studying the elevation drawing of a modernist pavilion he'd designed. "Perhaps you'll be the next Halloran to make a mark in architecture." Elijah accepted the compliment with a small smile. "Mom's been teaching me about sustainable design. I want to create buildings that work with nature, not against it." The casual acknowledgement of my influence, and Vivian's lack of reaction to it, represented progress I couldn't have imagined before the anniversary night. As we moved to the dining room for brunch, I caught Bennett watching me with a soft expression I'd nearly forgotten in the years of navigating Halloran family politics. He reached for my hand under the table as we sat, a silent communication of partnership that felt both familiar and new. The meal progressed pleasantly, conversation flowing around food and family news. Warren mentioned his sister Patricia's upcoming visit from Florida, and plans were made for a dinner that included me without question or hesitation. It wasn't until we'd finished the scones and moved on to coffee that Warren cleared his throat with obvious purpose, drawing everyone's attention. "Vivian and I have been doing some thinking," he began, glancing at his wife with an expression that combined affection and something more complicated. "About family legacy and what that really means." Bennett set down his coffee cup, instantly, alert to the serious turn in conversation. "What kind of thinking, Dad?" Warren reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between us. "We've made some changes to our estate planning. Nothing dramatic, but important nonetheless." Vivian's hands tightened slightly around her napkin, the only visible sign that this conversation might be challenging for her, but she nodded for Warren to continue. "The Halloran Family Foundation has traditionally been managed by direct Halloran descendants," Warren explained, referring to the charitable organization that had been part of the family for 3 generations. "We've amended the bylaws to include spouses as eligible board members." The significance of this change wasn't lost on me. The foundation was Vivian's particular domain, her most cherished project, and the center of her social standing in Mapleton. "Furthermore," Warren continued, sliding the envelope toward me, "we've nominated Amara to fill the vacant seat left by Judge Blackwood's retirement." I stared at the envelope, momentarily speechless. The foundation board was the inner sanctum of Halloran influence, traditionally reserved for blood relatives and a select few longtime family associates. My inclusion would be a public, irrevocable acknowledgement of my place in the family. "This was Vivian's suggestion," Warren added quietly, his eyes crinkling with what might have been satisfaction. I looked up in surprise, meeting Vivian's gaze across the table. Her expression remained carefully composed, but something in her eyes had softened. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps resignation tempered with respect. "Your work on the Oak Ridge Community Center demonstrated a commitment to accessible design that aligns with the foundation's objectives," she said formally, as if reading from a prepared statement. "The board would benefit from your perspective." Coming from Vivian, this practical acknowledgement of my professional worth was more meaningful than any effusive praise would have been. It represented not just acceptance, but a genuine, if reluctant, recognition of what I could contribute. "I'm honored," I said simply, accepting the envelope. "Thank you, Vivian." "Warren." Bennett's hand found mine again under the table, squeezing gently in silent celebration of this milestone. Across from us, Elijah watched with quiet satisfaction, the architect of a family reconstruction none of us had anticipated. "Well," Warren said after a moment, his voice lighter, "that's enough serious business for one Sunday. Who's ready for the chess rematch Elijah promised me?" As they moved to the living room where the chessboard waited, Bennett helped me clear the dishes, working alongside me with the comfortable rhythm we'd rediscovered in recent months. "You okay?" he asked quietly, loading plates into the dishwasher. I considered the question, feeling the weight of the foundation envelope on the counter beside us. "I'm surprised. I never thought your mother would willingly share any part of the foundation with me." Bennett nodded, understanding the significance. It's her way of making amends without having to say the words. Actions instead of apologies. The Halloran way, I observed with a small smile. Not anymore, Bennett replied, pausing in his task to face me directly. At least, not in our branch of the family. In the living room, I could hear Warren and Elijah setting up the chess pieces, Vivian offering occasional commentary on strategy. The sounds of family, imperfect, complicated, but undeniably real. Not anymore, I agreed softly. 5 years passed with the steady rhythm of family life. Birthdays, holidays, achievements, and challenges that wove themselves into the fabric of our shared history. Elijah grew from a thoughtful 12-year-old into a confident young man of 17, his talent for architecture blossoming under the combined influence of his parents' professional guidance and his grandfather's enthusiastic mentorship. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I stood on the grounds of Mapleton Heights Academy, surrounded by proud parents and faculty as the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Halloran Arts Center prepared to begin. The modernist building with its sweeping, glass facade and sustainable design elements represented not just my most significant professional accomplishment to date, but a personal milestone as well. Nervous? Bennett asked, appearing beside me in a charcoal suit that complemented my burgundy dress. After 17 years of marriage, the way his eyes still warmed when they found mine remained one of my life's quiet anchors. A little, I admitted, adjusting the prepared remarks in my hands. It's not every day you see your name permanently affixed to a building. The Amara Halloran Arts Center, the name had been unanimously approved by the Academy's board, much to my surprise. Even 5 years ago, the idea of my name standing alone without Bennett's preceding it would have been unthinkable in Mapleton Heights circles. Warren approached slowly, leaning on an elegant wood cane that Elijah had carved for his 75th birthday. At 83, he had grown frailer physically, but remained sharp-minded and engaged, his eyes still lighting up when discussing architecture or family matters. The old guard has gathered in the front row, he informed us with a mischievous gleam in his eye. Whitcombs, Prestons, Brightons, all eager to see what radical design elements you've incorporated this time. I smiled, remembering the minor scandal my sustainable water system had caused among the more conservative Academy trustees. They'll survive the shock of natural light and reclaimed materials. They always do, Warren agreed, patting my arm, affectionately. Progress comes whether they're comfortable with it or not. Behind Warren, Vivian approached with characteristic precision, each step measured and dignified despite her advancing years. At 81, she remained elegantly put together, her silver hair perfectly styled, her clothing tasteful and expensive. Age had softened her somewhat, not into warmth exactly, but into a more tempered version of her former self. The headmaster is ready to begin, she informed us, her gaze taking in the gathering crowd with practiced assessment. Elijah is escorting the mayor to his seat. My son appeared moments later, tall and lanky in his first tailored suit, his father's features, blended with something distinctly his own. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up secure in his place in the world, the greatest gift Bennett and I had managed to give him, despite the complicated family dynamics of his early years. "Mom," he said, reaching us, with a smile. "They're asking for you at the podium." The next half hour unfolded in a blur of formalities, the headmaster's introduction, the mayor's remarks about community investment in the arts. The polite applause of Mapleton society gathered to witness another milestone in the Halloran legacy. When my turn came to speak, I approached the podium with the confidence hard-earned through years of professional recognition and personal growth. Looking out at the assembled crowd, colleagues, community members, the Halloran extended family, I felt a momentary sense of wonder at the journey that had brought me here. Architecture, at its best, isn't just about creating spaces, I began, setting aside my prepared remarks to speak from the heart. It's about creating possibility. Every doorway is an invitation. Every window frames a new perspective. Every room holds potential for connection. My gaze found Elijah in the crowd, his expression intent as he listened. Beside him sat Warren, nodding slightly with each point, and Vivian, her posture perfect but her usual mask of polite disinterest, replaced by something more attentive. When I first came to Mapleton Heights 17 years ago, I was an outsider. An architect from Oak Ridge with different perspectives and experiences than many of you. Today, as we dedicate this art center, I'm still that same architect, still bringing those different perspectives. But I'm no longer an outsider. I paused, allowing the significance of those words to settle. In the front row, Patricia Whitcomb, now 90 and gloriously unfiltered in her old age, gave me a knowing smile and a subtle thumbs up. This building represents what happens when we make space for diverse voices and visions, when we recognize that tradition and innovation can coexist, when we understand that family legacies grow stronger through inclusion, not exclusion. Bennett's eyes met mine across the crowd, filled with the quiet pride and partnership we'd rebuilt in the years since that pivotal anniversary night. Beside him, Elijah's friend Sophia listened attentively, her hand occasionally brushing against my son's in the unconscious way of teenagers discovering first love. The Halloran Art Center will welcome students from all backgrounds, nurturing creativity that might otherwise go undiscovered. In these studios and performance spaces, young people will learn that their voices matter, their perspectives have value, and their presence makes our community richer. As I concluded my remarks and joined the headmaster in cutting the ceremonial ribbon, applause rose from the gathered crowd, not polite, perfunctory clapping, but genuine approbation that reflected years of earned respect in a community that had once viewed me as perpetually peripheral. The reception afterwards flowed through the light-filled atrium of the new building, guests admiring the sustainable features and innovative design elements that had become my professional signature. I moved through conversations with board members and faculty, discussing architectural choices and educational possibilities with the easy confidence that comes from being secure in one's expertise. "You've created something remarkable," a voice said behind me. I turned to find Vivian, a flute of champagne held delicately in her manicured hand. "Warren hasn't stopped talking about the cantilevered roof design for weeks." "Thank you," I replied, still sometimes surprised when Vivian offered direct praise rather than veiled critique. His input on the project was invaluable. Vivian nodded, her gaze traveling over the gathered crowd with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent decades as Mapleton's unofficial social architect. "They're calling it your masterpiece, you know. Even the Prestons, who objected, most strongly to the environmental elements." "High praise from the old guard," I observed with a small smile. "Indeed." Vivian sipped her champagne, her expression thoughtful. "You've managed something I never anticipated, Amara." "What's that?" "You've expanded the definition of what it means to be a Halloran, rather than simply fitting yourself into the existing parameters." The admission seemed to cost her something, but she continued nonetheless. "It's not what I would have chosen, but I cannot argue with the results." Coming from Vivian, this was tantamount to a standing ovation. We had reached a place of mutual respect over the years, never the warm mother-daughter relationship some might have hoped for, but a genuine acknowledgement of each other's value that felt, in its way, more authentic than forced affection would have been. "Thank you, Vivian," I said simply, accepting the compliment for what it was. "That means a great deal coming from you." She nodded once, then moved away to join a cluster of her contemporaries, her posture still regal despite her advancing years. Bennett found me moments later, slipping his arm around my waist in a gesture that had become comfortably familiar over our years together. "Everything okay?" he asked, having witnessed the exchange with his mother. "Better than okay," I assured him. "Your mother just paid me what might be the most honest compliment of our entire relationship." Bennett's eyebrows rose in surprise. Well, wonders never cease. They don't, do they? I agreed, thinking of all the unexpected turns our family journey had taken. Across the room, Elijah was showing Warren and a group of Academy trustees through the main exhibition space, pointing out design features with the confidence of someone who understood architectural principles from the inside out. No longer the quiet boy holding a secretive letter, but a young man coming into his own strength and vision. "He's going to be better than both of us," Bennett observed, watching our son with undisguised pride. "That was always the goal," I replied. "For him to stand on solid ground we helped build." As the afternoon progressed into evening, I found myself standing alone for a moment in the central gallery, surrounded by the physical manifestation of years of professional work. The space hummed with conversation and movement, light streaming through the carefully positioned skylights to illuminate the gathered community. Warren appeared beside me, his cane tapping gently on the sustainably sourced bamboo flooring. "Quite a day," he observed, his eyes bright despite the fatigue evident in the set of his shoulders. "Quite a journey," I amended. He nodded, understanding the deeper reference. "You know, when I wrote that letter 5 years ago, I never imagined it would change so much. I just couldn't bear to leave this world without someone knowing the truth." "Elijah knew what to do with it," I said. "He always sees things clearly." "Like his mother," Warren replied with a fond smile. "The boy has your moral compass, Amara, Bennett's creativity and my stubborn streak, God help him, but your unfailing sense of what's right." The compliment warmed me more than any professional accolade could have. "I'm grateful every day that he had you in his corner, Warren. That he still does." Warren's gaze drifted to where Vivian stood with Patricia, the two elderly sisters-in-law engaged in what appeared to be a spirited debate. "She's trying, you know, in her way. Change doesn't come easily after 8 decades of certainty." "I know," I acknowledged. "And I've made peace with what our relationship is, rather than wishing for what it isn't. That's been its own kind of freedom." He patted my hand, his own paper-thin skin marked with age spots but still warm with life. "The best kind of freedom, accepting what is while creating what can be." As the evening drew to a close, our family gathered on the terrace overlooking the Academy grounds. The setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, painting the world in gold and amber. Elijah stood at the stone balustrade, pointing out design features to Sophia, while Bennett discussed foundation business with Vivian a few feet away. In that moment, watching the people who had shaped my life, for better and sometimes for worse, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because everything was perfect, or because all wounds had been completely healed, but because we had built something real from the broken pieces of that anniversary night 5 years ago. The Halloran name still meant something in Mapleton Heights, but its definition had expanded beyond Vivian's careful curation. It now encompassed sustainable design and accessible spaces, artistic vision and academic opportunity. It included Bennett's quiet strength and Warren's moral clarity. It embraced Elijah's fresh perspective, and yes, even my contribution, the outsider whose insistence on being seen had ultimately transformed the family from within. I thought of all the women who had come before me, those who had swallowed their exclusion in silence, and those who had walked away rather than continue the fight. I thought of the 12-year-old boy who had stood up with his grandfather's letter when the adults around him failed to speak truth. And I thought of the countless invisible others, the spouses cropped from photos, the contributions erased. From family narratives, the voices silenced in the name of tradition, who never got the chance to claim their rightful place. "Mom?" Elijah called, beckoning me to join him at the balustrade. "Come look at this view of your building in the sunset. My building, my name, my family, my place in the world, not given as a gift or granted as a concession, but claimed through persistence and earned through contribution." I joined my son at the railing, our shoulders touching as we gazed out at the structure that would stand as part of the Halloran legacy long after all of us were gone. In the golden light of sunset, the glass facade reflected back the world around it, transformed into something new, yet connected to everything that had come before. Just like family, I thought. Just like legacy. Just like love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.